The day began like any other, the familiar scent of baking bread and sweet pastries filling the air as Dan opened the bakery. But something felt off. A faint warmth spread through his body, not the kind brought on by exertion, but a deeper, insistent heat that pulsed beneath his skin. He wiped his brow, brushing off the sensation. "It's just stress, that's all," he thought, focusing on kneading the dough. But the heat grew stronger, making his movements sluggish. His thoughts wandered to Ryan, and bitterness stirred inside him, mixing with the rising discomfort. Emma arrived mid-morning, her sharp eyes immediately noticing Dan's pallor. "Dan, are you okay? You look flushed." "I'm fine," he said, forcing a smile. "Just tired." Emma frowned but let it go. As the hours passed, Dan's condition worsened. His head spun, his hands trembled, and his body radiated heat. The realization hit him like a truck. My heat. I completely forgot it was almost time. Panic set in. He hadn't taken his suppressants. The situation with Ryan had left him too distracted. By the afternoon, Dan knew he couldn't stay at the bakery any longer. The faint scent he exuded would only grow stronger, and he didn't want to draw unwanted attention. Locking up the bakery with trembling hands, he stumbled onto the sidewalk, his body screaming for relief. The world around him blurred as he tried to walk home, his legs shaky and weak. Every step felt heavier, and the pounding in his head grew louder. He made it as far as a bench before collapsing onto it, clutching his arms around himself in a feeble attempt to control the overwhelming sensations. A sleek black car screeched to a halt nearby. Dan barely registered the sound before the driver's door opened, and Ryan emerged. His sharp, worried voice broke through the haze. "Dan!" Ryan rushed to his side, crouching in front of him. His hands hovered, unsure of where to touch. "What's wrong? Are you hurt?" Dan turned his head away, his voice weak but defiant. "I'm fine. Just leave me alone." But Ryan caught the faint, sweet scent in the air, and his alpha instincts flared. His eyes darkened as he pieced it together. "Your heat," he muttered, his voice dropping to a husky whisper. Dan's face burned with embarrassment. "I don't need your help. I can handle this," he mumbled, though his body betrayed him with a trembling weakness. Ryan didn't argue. Without hesitation, he scooped Dan into his arms, ignoring his feeble protests. "You're in no condition to argue. I'm taking you home," he said firmly, his tone brooking no debate. Ryan carried Dan into the penthouse, his steps quick and purposeful. Dan clung weakly to him, too drained to protest further. He was placed gently on the bed in Ryan's room. The cool sheets were a brief respite against Dan's overheated skin, but it wasn't enough. He shivered despite the warmth radiating from his own body. Ryan adjusted the thermostat, dimmed the lights, and brought a glass of water to Dan's bedside. "Drink this," he instructed. Dan hesitated, his pride warring with his need for relief. But his trembling hands couldn't even hold the glass. Ryan sighed and knelt by the bed, guiding the glass to Dan's lips. The cool water soothed his dry throat, but the heat inside him only intensified. "I'm fine," Dan muttered weakly, trying to push Ryan away. Ryan ignored him. "You're not fine. Stop pretending you are." Dan turned his face to the side, tears pricking his eyes. "Why are you here? You don't care about me. Why would you?" Ryan's jaw tightened, and his voice softened. "I'm here because I care, Dan, whether you believe it or not." As the night wore on, Dan's heat grew stronger. His body arched slightly, and soft whimpers escaped his lips. Ryan sat by the bed, his presence a mix of comfort and torment. Dan, half delirious, reached out and grabbed Ryan's hand. "Don't leave me," he whispered, his voice tinged with desperation. Ryan's heart pounded. Every instinct as an alpha screamed at him to act, to soothe Dan in the most primal way, but he clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay in control. "I'm not going anywhere," Ryan said, his voice low and steady. "I'll stay as long as you need." Dan's tears rolled down his cheeks. "I hate this. I hate feeling like this," he mumbled, his voice breaking. Ryan leaned closer, brushing the tears away with his thumb. "You're not alone. I'm here," he murmured, his tone surprisingly tender. He stayed by Dan's side through the night, cooling him with damp cloths and ensuring he stayed hydrated. It was a battle against his own instincts, but Ryan refused to let them win. Dan needed comfort, not complication. When Dan woke the next morning, the worst of his heat had passed, leaving him exhausted but clear-headed. He blinked against the soft morning light, filtering through the curtains, and turned his head to see Ryan, slumped in a chair beside the bed, fast asleep. Ryan's shirt was wrinkled, his hair disheveled, and his face lined with exhaustion. Dan's heart softened at the sight. Quietly, he slipped out of bed and padded to the kitchen to prepare coffee. When Ryan stirred, he found Dan holding out a mug for him. "You didn't have to do all that," Dan said softly, his eyes avoiding Ryan's. Ryan took the mug, his fingers brushing Dan's. "I'd do it again if I had to," he said simply, his voice still rough from sleep. Dan's cheeks flushed, and he bit his lip to hide the small smile threatening to appear. For the first time, he wondered if Ryan's care ran deeper than just obligation. As they sipped their coffee in comfortable silence, a fragile but growing bond began to form. A bond neither of them fully understood, but couldn't deny. The days following Dan's heat had been a whirlwind of confusion. Ryan had been nothing but caring, attentive even, but Dan couldn't shake the memory of the kiss between Ryan and Amelia. What was that all about? The image of them together, the way Ryan had kissed her so easily, so naturally, kept replaying in his mind. Had it been just a simple greeting between old friends, or was it something more? He told himself it was probably nothing. He was overthinking. It's not like Ryan owes me anything. This is just a business arrangement after all. I'm reading too much into it. But no matter how hard he tried to rationalize, doubt gnawed at him from the inside. The kiss had been a reminder of Ryan's past, of the life he led before they had entered into this arrangement. And it stung. Dan had been pacing around his small kitchen, an idea forming in his mind. Maybe he could do something to show Ryan that he appreciated his care. It wasn't much, but it was something. He needed to believe that their relationship could be more than just business. So, he texted Ryan. "Thank you for everything, Ryan. It really means a lot. If you can, come home early tonight. I was thinking of cooking dinner for us. My treat." It was a simple invitation, but Dan hoped it would signal a small shift between them, a moment to let down their guards. To his surprise, Ryan quickly responded, "Sounds great. I'll be home by 8. A small smile tugged at Dan's lips. Maybe this would be a chance for them to bond without the complications of business or awkwardness between them. He set to work, planning to prepare Ryan's favorite dishes, comfort food, something familiar to both of them. And of course, his favorite dessert, a rich chocolate cake with a warm fudge center that Dan knew would make his heart melt just as much as his taste buds. By 8 p.m., everything was ready. The smell of simmering stews and freshly baked bread filled the air, and Dan couldn't help but feel a small flutter of excitement. It was just a dinner, but it felt like a step toward something more. The table was set, the candles flickering softly in the dim light, creating a warm and inviting atmosphere. But as the hours passed, Dan began to feel a gnawing sense of unease. 8:30 came and went, then 9 o'clock, and still no sign of Ryan. His heart sank with each passing minute. Was something wrong? Had he forgotten? Had he decided not to come after all? Dan stood in front of the dishes, their warmth fading with each second. He reheated them, trying not to let the disappointment consume him. Maybe Ryan had gotten caught up in work. Maybe something unexpected had come up. It wasn't unreasonable to think so, but the pit in his stomach grew heavier with every thought. Unable to wait any longer, Dan picked up his phone and dialed Ryan's number. But before he could hit send, doubt gripped him once more. What if he's busy? He thought. What if he just forgot about me? Instead, he called Ethan. Ethan always seemed to have the answers, or at least, he seemed to know where Ryan was when no one else did. The phone rang twice before Ethan picked up. "Dan, what's up?" His voice was casual, but there was a hint of concern when he noticed Dan's tone. "I was just wondering if Ryan was coming home tonight," Dan asked, his voice tight. He had hoped Ethan would say something reassuring, but the reply shattered his hopes. Ethan said, his voice slowing, "Ryan's out. He's having dinner with Amelia." Dan's heart dropped to his stomach. Amelia. Of course. Ryan and Amelia had been friends for years. They were probably catching up, just like he and Ryan had during their earlier conversations, but hearing it aloud felt like a dagger to his chest. "How long is he going to be out?" Dan forced the words out, though his throat felt like it was closing up. "Don't know, man. Could be a while. I'll let you know if he decides to head back early, though," Ethan replied, a touch of awkwardness creeping into his voice. "Thanks," Dan muttered, hanging up before Ethan could say anything else. Dan stared at the phone in his hand, his fingers trembling. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, confusion, hurt, and anger all collided within him. Why didn't he tell me? Dan thought bitterly. Why did he promise me dinner and then go out with her? The silence in the apartment grew louder. The warmth from the meal now felt like a cruel reminder of what he had been hoping for, what he had been excited about. With a heavy heart, he stood, walking away from the table. The thought of waiting for Ryan to come back felt unbearable. He retreated to his room, closing the door softly behind him. As soon as he sat on the bed, the weight of the evening crashed over him. He had tried so hard to be hopeful, to believe in something that could be real, but it felt like every step forward was met with 2 steps back. The tears came quietly, as if they had been waiting for the right moment to finally break free. Dan buried his face in his pillow, unable to hold them in any longer. The ache in his chest was overwhelming, and he couldn't seem to escape it. Ryan's actions didn't make sense. Not to Dan, not in the context of their arrangement. Was he just being kind because he had to? Was Dan nothing more than a means to an end? And the kiss with Amelia, was it a reminder of what Ryan really wanted? Someone like her, someone he could have freely. Dan's mind spiraled as he clutched the pillow tighter, the darkness of loneliness creeping over him, filling the room with its heavy presence. For the first time in a long while, he didn't know what to believe anymore. The days following the dinner incident weighed heavily on Dan. He had spent so many sleepless nights replaying the events, the kiss with Amelia, the quiet nights, the confusion. Every time he thought about it, his stomach churned with a mix of emotions, betrayal, hurt, and anger. But what hurt the most was how easily he had let himself hope. No more, Dan told himself. He couldn't afford to let his emotions get the best of him again. Ryan might be kind, he might show small gestures of care, but that didn't mean anything. The contract between them was clear, and that's all it ever would be. He wasn't going to let himself fall for someone who had his own past, someone who was still tied to that life. Dan had decided it was time to set boundaries. When Ryan came home that afternoon looking apologetic but still distant, Dan stood his ground. "Ryan," Dan started, his voice steady but firm, "let's just keep it as a business, okay? I won't interfere in yours, and you won't interfere in mine." Ryan looked taken aback. He opened his mouth to speak, but Dan held up a hand, cutting him off. "I'm not interested in hearing your reasons. It's fine. We both know why we're doing this." Ryan's face tightened, but he didn't argue. He just nodded, though there was a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Dan turned away, trying not to feel the sting of disappointment, when Ryan didn't try to reach for him, didn't offer any comfort. As the days passed, Dan found himself falling into a routine again. Work, home, repeat. He tried to push the feelings aside and focus on what he needed to do, but then, unexpectedly, Theo appeared. Theo, Dan's high school crush. A charming, confident man with a smile that could light up the room. He had always been the center of attention in high school, and Dan had admired him from afar. But the years had passed, and Theo had moved on, carving out his own career in the city. Now, Theo was in town for a few days on business, and it just so happened that his schedule aligned with Dan's. They met up for lunch one afternoon, the conversation flowing easily, and for the first time in a long while, Dan felt a spark of excitement. Ryan, however, wasn't quite as indifferent as he had hoped to be. The first time he saw Theo and Dan together, chatting easily, laughing at some joke Dan had made, something inside him twisted. Ryan's eyes narrowed, watching them from a distance. He couldn't quite explain why, but seeing Theo smile at Dan like that ignited something in him, a possessive urge he couldn't ignore. As the days went on, Ryan couldn't help but find himself trying to insert himself between Dan and Theo whenever he could. He'd show up at the bakery unannounced, asking if Dan wanted to go out for coffee or dinner, just to pull him away from Theo's presence. Dan noticed it, of course. He saw the way Ryan subtly tried to draw his attention away from Theo. It was strange, but Dan couldn't bring himself to care. If Ryan was acting jealous, so be it. He had no right to feel that way. Meanwhile, Amelia had begun to take notice of Ryan's sudden coldness toward her. She had always been confident in her charm, knowing she could get Ryan's attention whenever she wanted. But lately, every time she reached out to him, Ryan seemed distant. At first, she thought it was nothing. Maybe Ryan was just busy or preoccupied, but it went on for days, and then she started hearing whispers. Ryan had been avoiding her, steering clear of any interaction with her. The more he did, the more frustrated Amelia became. She had been one of the few constants in Ryan's life, and now it seemed like he was pulling away from her. One evening, Dan and Theo decided to grab dinner at a new restaurant in town. It was a nice place, upscale, with a cozy atmosphere. Theo was in a good mood, and Dan couldn't remember the last time he'd felt this light-hearted. The conversation flowed effortlessly, and they shared stories from their past, catching up like old friends. But as they sat there, laughing and enjoying each other's company, Ryan's presence suddenly loomed over them. He was standing at the entrance, watching them, with a frown on his face. It was clear he wasn't happy. Dan could feel the tension rise. He glanced at Ryan, then quickly turned back to Theo, trying to ignore the way Ryan's gaze burned into him. Why was he here? As the evening went on, Ryan's behavior became harder to ignore. He kept hovering, inserting himself into their conversation every chance he got, making it clear that he didn't want Theo to have Dan's attention. Dan couldn't help but notice it, the way Ryan kept looking at Theo, the way his jaw tightened whenever they shared a laugh. It was jealousy. Ryan was jealous. For the first time, Dan truly understood the depths of Ryan's feelings, even if Ryan himself hadn't yet admitted it. The realization hit him hard. Does he really care about me? But before Dan could say anything, Ryan stood up abruptly. His voice was low and commanding, the familiar edge of control in his tone. Dan, he said, looking straight at him, don't go with Theo tomorrow. I don't want you out with him. Dan blinked, startled by the sharpness in Ryan's voice. What was this? He tried to understand Ryan's motive, but it was unclear. Why was Ryan suddenly so possessive? Why was he so adamant about stopping Dan from seeing Theo? Dan met Ryan's gaze for a moment, then turned his attention back to Theo. The moment felt loaded with tension, and Dan's heart began to race. This was no longer just a business arrangement. Something had shifted, something neither of them could ignore anymore. The day with Theo had been pleasant, a refreshing escape from the tension at home. Dan laughed, shared stories, and for the first time in weeks felt at ease. But as the sun set and he made his way back to the penthouse, an inexplicable heaviness settled in his chest. The apartment was dark when Dan entered, a stark contrast to the warmth he'd tried to bring earlier. He set his bag down and glanced around. No sign of Ryan. No note. No message. Nothing. With a sigh, Dan went to his room. He showered, letting the warm water soothe his nerves, and climbed into bed. Yet sleep eluded him. His mind raced, filled with questions he didn't want to admit even to himself. Was Ryan with Amelia? Was I just imagining things when he acted like he cared? Dan turned onto his side, pulling the covers over him. He told himself to stop thinking about it, to stop caring. Yet, the ache in his chest wouldn't go away. A loud crash jolted Dan awake. His heart leapt as he sat up, straining his ears. The faint sound of the front door creaking open, followed by another crash, echoed through the apartment. Dan's stomach twisted. A burglar? His eyes darted around the room until they landed on a heavy book on the bedside table. Clutching it tightly, he tiptoed to the door and peeked out. His breath hitched at the sight before him. It wasn't a burglar. It was Ryan. He stood in the dim light of the living room, a shattered wine bottle at his feet, and its contents spilled across the floor. His tie was undone, his shirt rumpled and half open, exposing his chest. Ryan swayed unsteadily, clearly drunk, as he tried to make his way toward the couch. Dan rushed toward him. "Ryan, stop! You'll step on the glass!" Ryan turned at the sound of Dan's voice, a lopsided smile spreading across his face. "Dan," he slurred, his voice heavy with alcohol and something else. Relief. "You're here." Dan carefully guided Ryan away from the broken glass, his heart pounding. "What's wrong with you? You could have hurt yourself." Ryan didn't answer. Instead, he reached out and cupped Dan's cheeks, his hands warm despite the chill of the night air. His eyes, though glassy from the alcohol, held an intensity that made Dan's stomach flip. "I missed you," Ryan murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Dan froze, his breath hitching. "You're drunk. Let me help you to bed." Ryan shook his head, his grip on Dan's cheeks tightening slightly. "No, I need to tell you this. I can't keep it in anymore." His voice cracked and Dan's heart clenched. "Ryan, you don't know what you're saying," Dan tried to reason, but Ryan interrupted him. "I know exactly what I'm saying," Ryan insisted, his words slurring but his tone firm. "I love you, Dan." Dan stared at him, stunned. His heart raced as the words hung in the air. "I've been such an idiot," Ryan continued, his voice breaking. "I didn't realize it until I saw you with Theo. I hated it. I hated seeing you smile at him like that. I hated knowing that he could make you happy in a way I couldn't." Dan's hands trembled. "Ryan, you're drunk. You'll regret this in the morning." "I won't," Ryan said fiercely, his eyes locking onto Dan's. "I've been a coward, Dan. I should have told you sooner, but I was afraid. Afraid you didn't feel the same. Afraid you'd leave me. Please, don't leave me." Before Dan could process what was happening, Ryan's lips were on his. The kiss was desperate and unrestrained, filled with a raw vulnerability that Dan had never seen in Ryan before. Dan's mind screamed at him to pull away, to stop this before it went too far. But his body betrayed him, responding instinctively to the heat and emotion behind Ryan's kiss. They stumbled toward the couch, their movements frantic and clumsy. Ryan's hands gripped Dan's waist, pulling him closer as their kisses deepened. Dan's hands found their way to Ryan's chest, his fingers brushing against the exposed skin. "Ryan," Dan murmured, his voice shaky. Ryan pulled back slightly, his forehead resting against Dan's. His breath was warm against Dan's lips. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm sorry for everything. For Amelia, for ignoring you, for hurting you. I need you to know how much you mean to me." Dan stared at him, his heart pounding. He could see the sincerity in Ryan's eyes, the pain and regret etched into his features. "Ryan." Dan's voice broke, and he leaned in, capturing Ryan's lips in another kiss. Clothes were shed, barriers broken, and all the tension that had built between them over the past weeks finally erupted. Ryan's hands explored Dan's body with a reverence that sent shivers down his spine. Their bodies moved together in perfect sync, their breaths mingling as they surrendered to the moment. Ryan whispered Dan's name like a prayer, his voice filled with emotion. Dan couldn't hold back the tears that slipped down his cheeks, overwhelmed by the intensity of it all. For the first time, he let himself believe that Ryan's feelings were real. The sunlight filtering through the curtains stirred Dan from his sleep. His eyes fluttered open to find himself in Ryan's arms, their bodies tangled together under the soft covers. For a fleeting moment, everything felt perfect. But then, the memories of the previous night came rushing back, and a mixture of joy and uncertainty clouded his thoughts. Carefully, Dan slid out of bed, not wanting to wake Ryan. He wrapped a blanket around himself and walked to the window, gazing out at the city skyline. His heart raced as he replayed Ryan's drunken confession. The man he had grown to care for had professed his love. But could he trust those words? Dan? Ryan's voice, groggy but soft, broke the silence. Dan turned, his breath hitching as Ryan sat up, his hair tousled and a sleepy smile on his face. "Good morning," Ryan said, his voice laced with warmth. "Good morning," Dan replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Ryan patted the spot beside him on the bed. "Come back here. We need to talk." Dan hesitated, clutching the blanket tighter around himself. "About what?" Ryan ran a hand through his hair, his expression serious. "About last night. I meant everything I said, Dan. I love you." Dan's heart skipped a beat, but doubt lingered. "Ryan, you were so drunk. What if you didn't really mean it?" Ryan stood, closing the distance between them. He cupped Dan's face, forcing him to meet his gaze. "I may have been drunk, but my feelings are real. I've been an idiot, Dan. I let my fear and pride keep me from admitting how much you mean to me, but I can't hide it anymore." Tears welled in Dan's eyes, and he shook his head. "Ryan, I don't know if I can trust this. You've hurt me so much before." Ryan's grip on him tightened. "I'll spend the rest of my life proving myself to you if I have to. Just don't shut me out." Dan searched his eyes, seeing nothing but sincerity. Slowly, he nodded, allowing himself a small smile. "Okay, but this won't be easy, Ryan." Ryan smiled, his thumb brushing away a tear on Dan's cheek. "I don't want easy. I just want you." Over the next few days, Ryan's behavior shifted entirely. He no longer hid his feelings, openly showering Dan with affection. He greeted him with kisses before heading to work, held his hand whenever they were out, and even started helping at the bakery on his days off. The change wasn't lost on others, especially Amelia. One evening she cornered Ryan outside his office. "What's going on, Ryan?" she asked, her tone sharp. "You've been avoiding me, and now you're parading around with him?" Ryan's jaw tightened, his gaze unwavering. "Dan is my husband, Amelia, and I love him. If you can't respect that, then maybe we shouldn't stay in touch." Amelia's eyes narrowed, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "I hope you know what you're doing." Meanwhile, Dan found himself slowly lowering his walls. Though hesitant at first, he began to trust Ryan's intentions. They spent more time together, sharing meals and stories. One evening, as they sat on the couch watching a movie, Ryan laced his fingers with Dan's and whispered, "I want this to last forever." Dan looked at him, his heart swelling with emotion. "Me too." However, lingering doubts and fears still crept into Dan's mind. He confided in Emma during one of their calls. "I think he's serious this time," Dan said, "but part of me is scared it's too good to be true." Emma smiled through the screen. "You're overthinking, Dan. Ryan's actions speak louder than words. Give him a chance." The contract binding their marriage officially ended, but Dan and Ryan chose to remain together. Ryan wasted no time in making their relationship official to the world. He publicly introduced Dan as his husband at a company event, silencing any rumors about their marriage being a business arrangement. Dan's bakery thrived as he poured his heart into his work, with Ryan often stopping by to help. Customers were charmed by the sight of the once distant CEO cheerfully serving coffee alongside his husband. One day, Theo visited the bakery, teasing Dan about his newfound happiness. "So, Mr. CEO finally won you over, huh?" Dan laughed, a blush creeping up his neck. "He did, somehow." Theo's smile softened. I'm happy for you, Dan. You deserve this. As time passed, Ryan proposed a proper wedding, a celebration of their love without the shadow of obligation. Dan hesitated at first, but Ryan's persistence and sincerity. The ceremony was intimate, held at the bakery where their story had truly begun. Surrounded by friends and family, Ryan and Dan exchanged vows that came straight from their hearts. I promise to love and cherish you, to stand by your side in good times and bad, Ryan said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. To trust and believe in you, to share my dreams and my heart with you, Dan replied, tears streaming down his face. As they kissed, sealing their vows, the room erupted in applause. Their journey had been anything but smooth, but in the end they found what they had both been searching for: love, trust, and a partnership built on mutual respect.